Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. And what a great privilege to be on the 7th version of the Delphi Economic Forum, having seen it grow over the years. It's also a great privilege to be discussing what I would have said clearly 6 weeks ago is the big issue of our time, which is the climate crisis, but I don't think these days there is anything more critical than the big humanitarian catastrophe that we live through with the Ukraine war. But we will touch on this during the discussion. The greatest privilege actually is to be discussing today with Dimitris Papalexopoulos, who actually wears many hats. We know him in Greece as the chair of the executive committee of Titan Cement Group, one of the biggest industrial groups in our country. Also as the chair of the board of VII, the Hellenic Federation of Enterprises. But Dimitris is also the vice chair of the European Roundtable for Industry, the ERT, and also leading ERT's Energy Transition and Climate Change Committee. I'm also joined by a great friend, Judith Wallenstein, who is a fellow partner in BCG. Judith also wears many hats. She leads what we call in BCG the climate moonshot, given the big effort we give behind climate change and how we can support the client, but also the BCG CEO advisory practice. Judith, it's really great to have you. Dimitri, it's really great to be with you. As said, it's really climate crisis. It's a big issue for our times, but what we have been through over the last 3 years, starting with the pandemic, now with the war, it has really made us step back and ask ourselves what are really the priorities. Around climate, of course, there is high targets, big ambitions in terms of reduction, but I think it is important when we prioritize key issues now to step back and say, what is the criticality? Why do we need to decarbonize? And maybe I will start with this more existential question, Judith.
And let me quickly recap, Vassilis, where we stand, right? Because if we look at where the world stands post-COP26, we trend between 2.1 and 2.4 degrees of a warmer world. So that obviously has still a big gap towards a 2 or even a 1.5 degree world in 2050, but specifically it has a very big delta for 2030. And the question of what we're going to do in the next 10 years will not only define the outcome, but it would also define the space of technology change, etc. I mean, even if you look at the 2 degree warmer world, I think it's always important to keep in mind that means in a projection when you look at the year 2100 that we live with a GDP per capita that's 13% lower than today. If you look at a world that would trend at current level of warming, we would talk about a GDP per capita that's a third lower than today. And even in a 1.5 degree warmer world, which I believe many of us are very skeptical if we can achieve it, you would still have GDP per capita dropping nearly 10%. In that middle scenario, let's say those 2.1, 2.2 degrees, that still pushes you into core climate tipping points. The melting of the summer Arctic ice shield, the melting of the Greenland ice shield. So it's not that 2 degree world is a very cozy world, but it has a very severe impact on civilization.
So big impact in terms of the economy, the global economy, big impact, as you said, in terms of civilization. We live it actually in Greece, having seen the impact of natural disasters, but I'm hearing lives and livelihoods are clearly affected. Now, when I look at the latest summit, the COP26, when the world came together to face exactly these risks and make decisions, that was a very different time. And now with the Ukraine war, whether we call it security of supply, whether we call it the cost of energy risks, I mean, what we live actually, especially when it comes to the energy sector, I mean, there are certain changes, if I were to say, that have happened. So, Dimitri, can you really take us through how we need to think through the difficult decisions, the tough trade-offs that need to be made in the short term, given the involvement over the last weeks?
Thank you, Vassili. And indeed, the world has changed since Glasgow. And let me start by saying unequivocally up front that I truly believe what you said initially. This is one of the defining challenges of our times, and we need to act urgently, decisively, and massively on climate change. Let me also preface this by saying that both as a business person and as a European, I'm very supportive of Europe's ambition to make Europe the first climate neutral continent by 2050. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but if it is done right, which is not an easy thing, it can actually be a win-win and eventually over the long term lead us not only to a better environmental outcome, but a better socioeconomic outcome as well. So the question is not whether, but how we address it. And the big challenge we face until we get to paradise is this very difficult transition period during which we have many competing priorities. And one way one can think about it is that we have a sort of a triangle in which we have at the top climate change that needs to be addressed. But at the same time, we have the need to have energy security and supply energy, sufficient energy at competitive prices to households and businesses. And we also have to worry about the competitiveness of European industry. Because if we end up having uncompetitive industry compared to what's happening outside of Europe, we end up having something that's called carbon leakage, where production migrates outside of Europe and you have a lose-lose. You not only lose jobs, but you actually at the end of the day have a worse environmental outcome as well. So that was already that transition was always going to be difficult to start with. It's a long-term transition. It won't happen in 2 or 3 years. And definitely the tragedy of the Ukraine is making it a lot more challenging, a lot more difficult, and a lot more expensive. And we should be aware, I think, that we're not talking about this winter, even if there is a positive outcome soon in the Ukraine, which I'm not sure many people expect. We should think of the need to think about how we deal with this over several years, not over a short period of time. So how do we think about that? I think it should definitely not become an excuse to dilute a climate ambition, but rethink priorities in how we go about it. So some areas are relatively easy. So I think there is, and I think you alluded to it earlier, this will give us, all of us, an impetus to move a lot faster in investing in green energy. That's not controversial. We have to get over the needing 6 to 10 years to get a permit to install green energy. There is a concentrated effort to do that a lot faster. We have to invest a lot faster in the grid that we need, and the connections we need, and the infrastructure we need to make this thing work. That part is again, not very controversial. Where it gets more difficult is how do you address, in the meantime, the next 3, 5, I don't know how many years of difficulty ahead, how do you address the cost of energy to households? Because there's a big risk that in this process, we lose society to the populace. And that would be a huge backdrop, to a step back for climate. Similarly, if we lose industry and industry migrates, it's a lose-lose as indicated earlier. So there are no easy solutions, there are no silver bullets, but there are instruments we can use. There's contracts for difference, there's taxation choices that can be made. And I think increasingly that debate has to be, between those competing priorities, has to be had in a way that's rational, without losing the long-term goal, but being realistic about the expensive and difficult compromises we have to make in the meantime.
And you know, Dimitri, I'd add, it has actually happened already, right? If you look at the price of filling your tank over the winter, that has gone up pretty drastically in countries like the UK. If you currently look at the discussion in a country that's depending more than the average of the EU and on Russian gas, Germany, 55% of Germany's gas is Russian. Nearly 90% of the population said this week, we do support a more aggressive build-out of renewables. Is that going to help us next winter? No, right? Does it mean the government can start encouraging the boiler to heat pump switches, all of these pieces? Is that going to get us independent of Russian gas in a year or two? Absolutely not. And if we assume that the price level for gas will remain at the current higher level, and the higher share of LNG in the gas mix will also lead to that. I think we have to address the social dimension of it more or less now, because the idea of the just transition, I think you see it shaking already.
Yes, I agree with that.
And we do see governments, I mean, at the national level, there is discussions at the European level that are happening, trying to use policy tools, policy interventions along the lines of taxation, subsidies, and also some of the tougher decisions like extending the Greek decarbonization timeline, etc., which is necessary, yet it is certainly not part of the solution. Maybe just to go back a bit to Glasgow. There was, when we met a few weeks before Glasgow, there was some gloom of what's going to come out of it. After Glasgow, and I know you were both there, so it will be interesting to give the perspective. I wouldn't say glow, but there was more optimism than one expected. And one of the things that came out as a ray of hope is this theme of collaboration in many different ways. So, of course, collaboration is within a sector, among countries, and so on. Dimitri, just looking at it from the inside and living it both from the Titan perspective, but also when you look at European industry and also from the Cement Association, etc. I mean, is this real? Is it actually happening? Do you see collaboration happening among corporates, but also corporates at the country level, etc.?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that struck me in Glasgow, and I think we all went with fairly low expectations to Glasgow, and that helps go clear the bar, was I personally, one of the things that struck me was I saw a real change in the attitude of business over the last 2 or 3 years. So up until a year or 2 or 3 years ago, the attitude of business is, if you want us to decarbonize us, tell us what the rules are, give us the incentives so we can act. And now what we see increasingly is that business, urged along by society, by their customers, by the financing and everything, business is now saying, we are doing it. And you can either help us go faster or you can stand in the way, but we're doing it anyway. And as businesses go from arguing to implementing, they increasingly realize, as they take action, that this is not stuff they can do alone. No business, no matter how big, can do this alone. This requires collaboration between business and government. This requires a lot of collaboration with universities and research and venture capital. But most importantly, I would argue, as you suggested, Vassilis, it requires collaboration across borders. Because we are trying to deal with a global problem without having a global government. And the Glasgow process is a very slow and ineffective and inefficient process to achieve global progress. So I'd like to share one example, perhaps, from my own industry, put my cement hat on. Cement is one of the most heavy emitters of carbon in the world. The process itself is very emissions intensive. But the nature of the product is such that regulating country by country is a catastrophe. It doesn't work. You have to look at it sectorially, globally, internationally. So we got together a few years ago and created what we call the Global Cement and Concrete Association. And there we have set a target of providing the world with carbon-free construction materials by 2050, fully realizing and saying that we don't have all the technologies to get there yet, and we don't know how to get there. But we have a path to zero, which we publish, which says how we're going to go about it. And part of that is banding together under competition laws to do some basic research that no single company can do alone. But it's also getting, publicizing and verifying all emissions in a way common across the world. What's fascinating to me, and that's why I'm bringing this example on, is that we've managed to bring under one roof 80% of the world's cement industry outside China. And a few Chinese, but not many. And I don't know if we'll come back to this later, but how China acts on this is going to be a huge determinant of where we head. And there, that battle is not very clear to me how it will be won. But we have in the association not only the usual suspects in Europe and North America, but we also have the Indians, the Latin Americans, the Africans. And that ability to have a collaboration between the developing world and the developed world, it's nowhere near perfect, it's nowhere near yielding the results we need, but it's the spirit of where we need to go that's important here.
Well, that's an optimistic message. If you're able to bring along the Chinese, the Indians in...
We have not brought along many Chinese yet.
Okay.
And they are half of the world's production. So that's a key outstanding challenge.
So let's go now to cooperation in the EU and the EU being at the forefront with the EU Green Deal, big targets in terms of reducing emissions by 55% in 2030, but again, 27 countries, different economic environments, etc. If we can discuss a little bit about not the ambition, which is no doubt the highest, but readiness and ability to execute on this.
The Fit for 55, let me say a couple of clarifications first. Fit for 55 is a proposal made by the European Commission last July. It is not yet voted into law. It's still being debated. That's observation number one. Observation number two is Fit for 55 was back engineered. So it was not what we think is doable. It was saying, if we want to be at zero at 250, where do we need to be at 230 to be on track? And it's not 55 across the board. It's more where we know the technologies exist, less elsewhere. So it's a back-engineered number that was ambitious to start with, but there Europe did the right thing and took a detailed, holistic approach and broke it down and gave it a total package of incentives and sticks and carrots to make it work. And so, yes, it was ambitious and doable. Now, the reality is that the facts have changed. Ukraine changes the facts here. I'm stating the obvious, but natural gas was going to be a big part of that transition process as a fuel to complement, during the transition, green energy. That doesn't look as if it's going to be available in the quantities we need, and it's certainly going to be much more expensive. So I think it is important that this debate is still open, and I think we have to approach it again, not take it as a given, not get scared of reopening that can of worms, because pretending that we don't have to reopen it is dangerous. I'm not suggesting we have to change the numerical target, but we have to rethink on the basis of existing facts how we deal with the immediate challenges. As you pointed out, for example, we have to take a different look at nuclear. We have to take a different look at solid fuels again. How can we deal with each of those? Let's not make this a religious debate. Let's make it a fact-based debate.
So it's again about the how rather than the what. Judith?
Yeah, I'd also say it's very worth in this debate, and I think that's where you were getting at, Dimitris, to say, you can say across all industries, 50% of emissions can be abated at very low or no cost. And that obviously looks very, very different for a cement player than it looks for a food producer or a fashion producer. But the economics of these 50% have changed as well, as you laid out, but they haven't completely gone. And so I would always look at it saying, there are many near-term measures that companies have been looking at and will keep looking at. But as you were mentioning, it doesn't help to be religious about saying the economics of that haven't changed, because they have.
What about technology? Because that was one of the big topics actually this morning, big debate on hydrogen. Again, not about the what, but about the how fast, the trade-offs, etc. And hydrogen is one of the main technologies that are being discussed. There is also direct air capture, the long duration, energy storage, sustainable aviation fuel, just to mention a few. Where do we see Europe heading on that front? Also, is it in the right direction if we look at the other big market, the US?
You look at me as if I'm the specialist, but let me try anyway.
I would like both of your perspectives.
I think a good part of the technologies we need to get to zero are available today, and it's just a question of driving the economies of scale and the costs down. Some of them are already pretty competitive. Some, there's a clear path to get there. But many of the technologies we need are either not existent yet or still very much in an exploratory stage. The good news is that there's serious money now pouring into this all over the world. And so I think we can expect over the next few years to see real progress. One area you did not mention, Vassili, which I understand is attracting a lot of interest, especially in Silicon Valley, is this confluence between digital and decarbonization, which apparently has a lot of potential to move things faster and more effectively in a meaningful way. Now, of the few technologies you mentioned, I'm not a specialist, but I would argue that carbon capture or air capture is still at a very much an experimental stage. Aviation fuel is a niche thing. Hydrogen is maybe 10% of the solution, but the encouraging thing there is that there's now serious, not only public money, but private money involved. I think Volvo and Daimler have committed serious money to using hydrogen in heavy trucks. The steel industry is putting money in hydrogen in steel. So that is not a silver bullet, but it's a part of the solution. My personal favorite would be the long-term energy storage as a something that can really unlock a significant improvement. The key, and sort of the fascinating discussion with me is how quickly do you commit to a certain technology at the risk of betting on the wrong horse, but with the benefit of driving then things much faster, as Europe is doing with hydrogen right now? Or do you take a more American view of things and let the market decide, which sometimes leads to better solutions, but a more messy and inefficient and slower process?
Yeah, and add to your point, the whole question of the timeline, right? Because if you look at the more established technologies such as solar, wind, batteries, and you look at where our wildest forecasts were in 2010, we're now factor 2 to 30 in revenue above what was forecasted. We've brought costs down a lot faster, but still it has been 12 years. And if you look at, for 55, if you look at 2030 and the gap we have to close, you must hope that we bring the green premium on direct air capture, carbon capture and storage, long duration storage down a lot more quickly than 10 years. And I think timing in this will be a major challenge.
Something that I find extremely encouraging actually is in terms of not only the technology sector coming forward, but also if I see the finance industry coming together, looking at private equity, but also universal banks and how they collaborate with, for example, the Catalyst endeavor, looking at actually committing for experimentation on the green technology front, which I think it's something we have not seen before, and it's certainly encouraging us on, first of all, the financial backing that will be there, but also the speed.
And I think, if you take it back to what technology players can do, and you look at the car industry, the Tesla example, in a way, has shown how one player has started changing the industry, because we always forget that their first car that was fully electric was 2006, 2008. And if now you look how the entire OEM landscape has changed, how that has triggered net zero commitments of all the automotive supply industry, you actually see that the agency of the individual players is probably bigger in some areas than we thought.
Absolutely. Let's come to Greece now, since we've discussed a lot about the climate crisis from a global perspective, from a European perspective. I think we are all proud having seen the Greek government being at the forefront in terms of the ambition, in terms of setting a master plan for decarbonization, but at the same time having the same issues we were discussing before that the rest of the world is facing around energy prices and what the implications of the war are on electricity bills, and of course the political implications that this may have as well. Dimitri, in your view, if we take now the perspective from Greek industry, but also from the Greek economy, how do you see the latest developments in terms of prices, etc., impacting the government ambition, and where does CEF stand?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stick to the a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but a lot of pain and suffering in between theme that I think we've been working on. So I think long-term green energy is a great opportunity for Greece. We have some competitive advantages, and over the long term, it can, should, and I think will be a big boon for Greece. But until we get there, the transition will be much more difficult and more expensive for Greece, and for reasons I will explain, than most other European countries. One observation, I guess, also obvious that we should keep in mind is that 80–90% of the decisions are taken in Brussels, and the degrees of freedom that we have as part of the European Union are fairly limited. So the playbook is more or less pre-agreed. Now, within that context, Greece has certain challenges where it is today. One is geographic location. We are far away from the center of Europe, not well interconnected, closer to, and this is important for industry, closer to other suppliers that are outside of the European Union that do not have the same burdens and challenges. And we also have been late at developing our infrastructure. We have underinvested in infrastructure, and we have not yet a well-functioning energy market. Put all that together, and adding the dependency on Russian gas is going to make a big challenge. It's going to be translate into a big challenge. And again, as we said for Europe, this is not a challenge for this coming winter alone. As you pointed out, Judith, this is, I don't know how many years, but it's my guess would be 4 to 5 years until we get to where a lot of the stuff matures that will start making a big difference. And in the meantime, I think we have to use all the instruments, same as at the European level, all the instruments that we have to, of course, start by protecting weaker households, because the social cohesion here is of the essence. But at the same time, there is a bigger risk in Greece because of its location to industry, an energy-intensive industry in this transition. And that is something where I am personally quite concerned. I don't see easy solutions, and if we don't address them, we are in a very risky situation.
Yeah, and very difficult to find short-term answers, but I want to go back actually to first of all, the overall theme that we need to be open-minded, think out of the box, but you also mentioned the nuclear energy aspect as well, and the debate has reopened globally in Europe very vividly, and there was the interesting case that came up about Bulgaria and to what extent there could be collaboration actually on the nuclear energy front. Where do you stand on that?
If I'm not a specialist on energy, I'm certainly not a specialist on nuclear energy. But doing nuclear energy in Greece would have been hugely controversial because of the seismic activity, among other things, in our organization. It would have taken 10, 15 years at best. So it would have been probably a very challenging idea. The idea of piggybacking on the existing nuclear energy nuclear producers in Bulgaria and financing that, the expansion of that, in return for a long-term contract of nuclear energy, sounds to me like a brilliant idea. But again, I don't know enough to pass judgment. But I would have liked it to be my idea.
Great. Well, you know, as we said, there is no golden bullet. I think we need to examine many different options, and I think everything should be on the table, especially for how we cross the bridge for the short to medium term. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, and I think there is many interesting thoughts that came in the discussion, and I really hope that we will have the war behind us, even though the structural challenges will remain, and be as focused as possible on addressing the climate crisis. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.